Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to everyone and special welcome to Marijn.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, no, it's just started my work at university again, and it's been fun, and so that's really
Right.
wonderful. Yeah,
I think we had just touched on that news in our last video, and this is a
I
kind
think
of
so.
follow-up, a sequel to our previous discussion, which we titled Muslims and Non-Muslims Studying the Quran. Not studying the Quran together, but sometimes we can, right? So
Right, right.
that's where this video picks up on something that we mentioned last time, that we're collaborating on a paper, which we did indeed get to present in a beautiful town
And
or city,
very, very hot.
very hot
I know.
city called Palermo in Sicily, which was a wonderful experience, and actually our first time to meet in person. That was secretly the main reason I went there, actually,
Right, right, right.
was to take this digital relationship on another level. And we presented our paper on sources and strategies in translating the canonical readings of the Quran. Albeit a paper still in progress, we are not quite yet at the publishing stage. But this video is also a little bit of motivation to get that going by benefiting from people's interest and feedback. How did you find the feedback from our first online conversation, Marijn?
I think it was fun. A lot of people seem to enjoy it. Thought it was interesting, and it was enjoyable to do. I think we touched upon a lot of interesting questions, interesting topics, and interesting. I think also, interesting. Well, things that people, I don't know, wonder about, worry about, or are kind of like, feeling weird about. It's like what's going on with that, and I think we were able to like clear the air in a sense on that question. It's like, no, I mean, we
Yeah,
can work together, work with each other, work around each other, and these kinds of things.
I mean,
Yeah.
even with different points of view, because I
Right.
think when it comes to qira'at of the Quran, we do have somewhat different perspectives, and that goes
Hmm.
back to our perspectives about the Quran itself, right?
Right.
So I come from a position, a scholarly position and belief position about the revelation of the Quran, its divine origin, therefore a certain view about the intent of multiplicity, right? So when it comes to there
Hmm.
being multiple readings, I would have a certain point of view that follows from the
Hmm.
intentionality of revelation, right, and divine authorship. Um, and your commitments, background, approach, and some of the methods will naturally vary, as I'm sure you'll get to
Hmm.
elaborate in our discussion. But I think there's also a considerable amount of overlap when it comes to
I think so.
scholarly processes, thought processes, the sources that we have to look at. And what I appreciate about your scholarship is also you take very seriously the scholarship of Muslim tradition,
Hmm.
as do I. And at the same time, we try to actually be in conversation with those earlier scholars. We try to build on what they did rather than just taking it as given and as
Yeah.
concluded. So why don't you perhaps give us some idea about the type of interest you have in the qira'at, and you can link this perhaps to the project that you're now undertaking at Leiden University.
Yeah, sure. So um, so my background is in linguistics ultimately, and so I'm interested in linguistic history mostly. And the past years I've mostly been focusing on linguistic history of the Quran, of Arabic in general. Um, and as I was working on this and as I was looking into this, I noticed, there's this whole field of qira'at. Which, well, not only are of course of interest to translation and to meaning of the Quran, but there's the vast majority of the differences between the reading traditions are actually linguistic. That is, things that are quite difficult to translate, and we'll run into a couple of these where it's like, well, does it even make sense to translate this, or doesn't it? And at the same time, even when it does make sense to translate something differently, or if there is some subtle difference in meaning, there is a different interpretation of the grammar of basically the same consonantal skeleton. And that really interested me in general, as you know, coming from a linguistic perspective. It's a really interesting puzzle. It also has a lot of history, which is very interesting. I mean, the canonical reading traditions really quite obviously go back to the historical figures that they're, you know, attributed to. And, you know, that brings us to the 2nd century Hijri, if not the 1st century, actually. And so that kind of got me interested in that. And actually, so I currently have a new project, a 5-year project, really big. It's an ERC project, where I'll be working together with several other people to look at the history of the Quranic reading traditions based on manuscript evidence. And this is especially interesting to me because, first of all, it's just not been done, but we have hundreds of manuscripts with vocalization, where we can actually see what the reading traditions were like and were intended by the people who did the vocalization. And these manuscripts that I'm interested in generally come from before the canonization of the reading tradition. So from, you know, before Ibn Mujahid in the 4th century. So we can actually look, and once we look, we see all kinds of interesting things. Of course, we see readings that we recognize. Yeah.
So hold on a second. The common wisdom is that early manuscripts do not have, you're saying vocalization, by which you mean vowel signs, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So can you clarify, you know, the status of the early manuscripts with regards to vowel signs?
Yeah. So it's true that the very earliest manuscripts that we have do not have any vowel signs. And the reason why they don't is because the vowel signs have not been invented yet. So, you know, if you don't have vowel signs, you can't write them. But around the 8th century, so 2nd century Hijri, they develop a system of red dots that they start using to write in the manuscripts. Very beautiful, very nice to look at. Just aesthetically, I think it's incredibly attractive. And those give us insight. And we don't really know how early those have been invented. The invention has been attributed to Abu Aswad ad-Du'ali, who dies 84 Hijri. Well, if that attribution is true, which doesn't seem unlikely, but not necessarily provable, then it's pretty early. We have a couple of really early manuscripts which have vocalization, but since they're done with a different ink than the text itself, we cannot tell if someone, you know, came in 2 centuries later, the same time or not.
Yeah.
So we don't know. And we only start being able to be sure that it happened at the same time once we get to like these classical Kufic manuscripts, where we see a certain correlation between types of vocalization and type of style, and certain styles just never come without vocalization. So it was clearly part of the production process. But yeah, the time where we're actually certain that the vocalization is basically contemporary with the manuscript, we're in the 3rd century actually. But it seems quite clear that there were probably a couple of early ones. So Umayyad period, it seems vocalization had been invented already. We have a couple of clearly Umayyad Qurans that have vocalizations that don't quite look like the classical system, like the standard system they use. So some of them don't really have a way of, one of them doesn't have a way to write tanween yet. Well, after that, they come up with using 2 dots for tanween. And, you know, that dot being absent gives the impression that that's an earlier system, a more primitive system. So, you know, but these are all questions that we just don't know answers to yet. So that's one of the things that I'll be answering. And one of the interesting things about it is, like, even though some of the reading traditions that we see in these manuscripts are clearly recognizable, so we see a lot of Warsh, easily recognizable, you know, very typical reading. We see a lot of Abu Amr, but we also see tons of manuscripts, like really a lot of them, that do not fit any of the canonical readings, which really suggests that, you know, the kind of variation that was there before the canonization was really quite broad and quite big, which, you know, was of course the reason for the canonization. But it's good to see that actually checks out.
So naturally, we're going to talk about this concept of canonization. It's a word we're using for, in a way, the reduction of the accepted readings, the circulated readings, the Quranic deemed readings, to the 7, right? Sometimes people say sevenization, tasbih as-sab'a, at the hands of Ibn Mujahid. So that's quite pivotal to our our conceptualization of the qira'at, what they are, how they relate to each other, how they relate to the meaning of the Quran as well. Because, the presentation that we are working on here, or what we're sharing today, and the paper that we're working on, is is jumping a few steps forward to the implications for meaning, which of course show up in works of tafsir mostly, right, in exegetical works, and then for translation of the Quran, which of course there are many translations of the Quran, and there continue to be new translations of the Quran, but mostly they aren't taking into account the fact that there are multiple canonical readings, that is, readings which are considered equally to be authoritative as Quran, are considered to be actually the Quran, and not as, there's the Quran and then there's the readings of the Quran separate to that, right? So there would be certain words where there is more than one way of vocalizing it. That could be to do with the vowel. It can also be then down to the consonant itself. It can be a difference in how that word is realized altogether. And then that meaning, that difference may or may not have an impact on meaning, right? So here is where you often get this generalized statement by, let's say, by Islamic preachers rather than scholars, who will say, for example, yes, well, first they might start off by saying, you will never find any variation in any letter or any vowel in the entirety of the Islamic world. Well, this is not true, because we've got something called the qira'at. And then they might say, okay, I just heard about the qira'at now, but let me declare that there's never ever a difference in meaning. And here we'd have to say, well, yes, sometimes there is, and that's a very well-established fact. It's not like a scary revisionist claim or something like that. We have not just all the tafsir works, but specifically, and this shelf here is full of these works, of tawjih al-qira'at, that was all about, sometimes called ma'ani al-qira'at, right? The meanings of the qira'at. That means that they have meanings, and those meanings can vary. Even to the extent, and here's where I'll tread cautiously, where people then say, okay, but there's no contradiction between them. I agree to a certain extent, and like it's not the type of contradiction that becomes a problem theologically, right? But sometimes the qira'at are giving you different stories, or they're even giving you two different possibilities, which, at least with a bit of a stretch, you could say, but they cannot be mutually reconciled. That's the point. Not that they necessarily contradict, not like we've got big, differences that will cause a breakdown in the theological schools or positions. But we'll see examples where, if we think about it, they can't sort of both hold at the same time. You have to kind of decide. But that, for me, as a person involved in interpretation, is like nothing new that comes to the table, because even without taking into account the qira'at, there can be matters of interpretation where it can only be this way or that way. It can't be both, right? So I wouldn't call that a contradiction. I'd just say that's a case of where you have to determine which way you're going to go. And for the reciters also, they had to choose a way of vocalizing according to different factors that they took into account. So they had to take into account not only the transmission and the strength of the transmission, the authority of who they are taking the Quran from, and the accordance with the written form of the Quran, the Uthmanic orthography, and they had to take into account the Arabic language, right? That things should be grammatically reasonable, clear, the best form, or the way that is most familiar to that reciter and the region that he's in. But sort of with the last one, let me add also the way that they deemed the meaning to be realized, right? So just like in the case of waqf and ibtida, like where to stop and pause, where to consider the sentence to be breaking, it's not a case of just like you receive it as is and then the meaning is derived from that. Rather, the meaning informs the way that you vocalize the text, right? So the famous one in verse 7 of Ali Imran, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. Do you stop in إِلَّا اللَّهُ? Well, you will stop here if you understand the mutashabih, right? We might use the word, the ambiguous terms or something, ambiguous verses of the Quran. If you understand that to be things that cannot be understood except by Allah, then you will stop there, when none knows its interpretation except God. But if you understand the mutashabih to be something that is interpretable by referring it back to the muhkamat, to the foundational clear-cut texts, then you wouldn't have a problem with saying وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. Right, you wouldn't have a problem with joining on that none knows its interpretation except God and those who are firmly established in knowledge. And we can find that early scholars, reciters, transmitters, took one stance or the other, right? And that would affect what the mutashabihad then means. But there's this kind of, it does affect each other, like how a person recites is affected by meaning just as much as the meaning is affected by how we realize the text. And that's not me saying, therefore, that they just had a meaning in their mind and then just said whatever, or they did it randomly according to the writing or something like that. But if someone has received or heard, or there's more than one possibility that they consider reasonable, then they have the scope for choice, which is the word for that in the tradition is ikhtiyar, right? So they're selecting how to how the text will be pronounced, without necessarily ruling out that other things are fine as well, right? So when these imams of qira'ah, the famous ones, of the 7 and then the other 3 that became the 10, or others beyond them, when they said, okay, I'm reciting this way, that doesn't mean in every case that they thought, well, I wouldn't recite that way, I'd never recite that other way. Mm-hmm. Right? So I guess we're kind of on the subject of canonization now, right? Like, what is this process? I'll let you share your thoughts in a moment, but I'll try to give it a nutshell. The way I prefer to look at this situation. You had a proliferation of readings, and you're investigating now the pre-Ibn Mujahid period and what's happening there. And I think we really do need more data about that. We really need and more analysis of that data. But what goes without argument, I think, is that there were many ways of reading and compiled ways of reading based on individual readers that were that were prominent in their regions. And that's why you have some books that were like with 50 qira'at, for example. I think the first books were written, they had like 50 qira'at in them. With Ibn Mujahid, you had an attempt to just limit that number to something that seemed logical. There's a lot of discussion about why 7, and was that in some way supposed to have some connection with the fact that they have these traditions about the 7 ahruf, or the 7 letters. What we do know is the 7 ahruf are not the 7 qira'at, but was the number 7 related to it? But what do you think? Do you think number 7 was related to that?
I don't know. There's something kind of funny about it, because of course Ibn Mujahid chooses one reader for each prominent region, right? So he takes one from Mecca, one from Medina, one for Sham, one for Basra, and then 3 for Kufa. Was he doing 3 for Kufa to get to the 7? That's one way of thinking about it. I don't think so. Other people have argued, well, look, Kufa was a place where the reading of Ibn Mas'ud continued to be popular, which was a non-canonical reading in the sense that it did not follow the Uthmanic rasm. It was a pre-Uthmanic recitation, but seems to have actually had some popularity for some time. And so maybe there was just no one popular reading, and all of these were competing with each other because it didn't have the same amount of time yet to kind of land. That's a very nice just so story. I'm not sure if it's the right story.
Could
But
be.
you know, it's not ridiculous. I mean, it's not a stupid suggestion, but it's just I'm not sure if that's it. And it's really difficult to get insight into it because, you know, if you just look in the book, he just goes, well, you know, these are the three readers. It's like, okay, but why these three? Why did you choose one for all the other ones? And it's like, what's going on there? That's a bit of a question. Yeah.
Yeah, so it may not be to do the 7 ahruf, might just be the number 7 is also a little bit of a, you know, a number that, you know,
A nice number. Yeah.
rather than 6, rather than 8,
Right.
7.
Right. No, I mean, maybe so. And but it seems quite clear, at least, that the 7 was not considered some kind of magical number. So even Ibn Khalaway, who we'll certainly be talking about, he wrote his own book, and he wrote about 8. He added Yaqub to the mix, who's one of the Basra readers. So he didn't feel
Who
like
later is one of the 10 as well. So
yeah, that's right.
So, okay, with canonization, we have this. So canonization is, of course, a Western word, Orientalist kind of word, but I like it. For me, it reflects what it means to talk about al-qira'at al-mutawatira, right? So this is a terminology that is used in Islamic scholarly contexts, and I think it maybe gives a kind of confusion about what exactly we're describing as mutawatira. And in fact, this point I think comes down to even what we mean by qira'at, right? And you know, I think we've got some terminology we can share, but maybe still some work needs to be done to make this really crystal clear. Let me try. So you've got the qira'at, which is when they talk about qira'at, or even a harf sometimes, what they mean is a specific way of realizing a specific word, right? So in a word like uf, we have multiple qira'at. What are they? The canonical ones, I think, is just uffin and uffi. But we have in the, you know,
I don't know. Either way,
we have in
we
the
have all of them.
Generally, we've got lots of ways that was realized. So each of these is a qira'ah, right? It doesn't mean so that just means that word is pronounced in multiple ways. There are many qira'at in that word, right? And then you've got the what's called a qira'ah, which is like where one qari, say Imam Asim or Hafs, who is transmitting from Asim, okay? So he recites from the Fatiha to An-Nas with a whole set of what we term usul, so particular rules and patterns that he follows in kind of dialectal matters, largely in pronunciation, and also specific choices at specific junctures. So what does he do in uffin? How is he going to say that particular word, right? And this is what's known as the farsh. So that, I think your practice has been to call this a reading tradition. So that's one meaning of qira'ah is a compiled reading, right? So a collection of all these choices and possibilities from the start of the Quran to the end of the Quran. That's a qira'ah, right? That's where we say there are 7 qira'at, or later with Ibn al-Jazari, there were 3 that were still sufficiently circulated for them to be then sort of restored with their status along with the 7 to become the 10 qira'at. And then you've got their sub readings. So in a way, we don't have the reading of Asim by himself. We have 2 versions of Asim's reading, which is from Hafs and Shu'bah. So these are not called qira'at, these are called riwayat. So in a way, we don't have 10 qira'at so much as we have 20 riwayat of 10 qira'at, right? But that's fine. The point is, these are called qira'at mutawatira, I believe, as a very close correspondence with what we say when we say canonical readings. And that is to say, they are the readings which, the reading traditions which have been received and accepted and continued to be circulated and promoted with the agreement of the Muslim community as centrally kind of resolved by Ibn Mujahid's project, right? Because otherwise there could be dispute between the regions and there could be a sense of, okay, but which region has got actually the best reading? So it was to make it clear that, first of all, there is an acceptance of variation, but also a limitation of that variation. So we have now a canon of recitations So I don't know who started calling them al-qira'at al-mutawatir. I don't know if that's something that you find with Ibn Mujahid, but wherever it pops
No,
up,
certainly not.
you might have
Well,
the data on that. But whatever it
Yeah.
is, I think that what they either meant or ought to have meant is along the lines of how I explained it. And not, and this is the crucial part, not necessarily that every word and choice within each of these is mutawatir in some technical sense, which you find in usul al-fiqh, for how something was transmitted successively by numerous people in every generation, particularly back to the Prophet ﷺ. That I don't think is the claim that's being made for every wajh or every option in the whole of these compiled readings. It is a statement about the reading as a whole, as a generality. But then you can find within those that some individual choices could still be within the scope of being criticized as well, right? So that's why, like, when we read someone like Imam al-Tabari, and al-Tabari, by the way, is before Ibn Mujahid, so crucially, we can't hold him to the standards of post-canonization. But there are some people who are coming after as well, like Zamakhshari, for example, who would say about certain individual choices that this is problematic. And Ibn Mujahid himself, maybe I'll let you touch on that. Ibn Mujahid himself criticized a number of individual readings, even while transmitting them and even while canonizing them.
Yeah. Let me add a couple of thoughts to this. So certainly it's true. So this is one of the things that Shadi Nasser has also touched upon. It's like where does this conceptualization of tawatur, of the qira'at, come from? Because Ibn Mujahid just doesn't use the word. He really doesn't. And you see, so it's very notable. I mean, we've noticed this, and I think a lot of people see this, that Abu Hayyan, for example, in his Al-Bahr al-Muhit, has a very clear sense of, there's tawatur of the qira'at, and he can get quite upset, actually, when people say that, even a single reading is not necessarily considered to be, mutawatira. And so a specific variant, and he's like, no, look, I mean, it's been transmitted. These are, mutawatira. Why would you say that these aren't? But what's interesting about this is that Ibn al-Jazari, who canonized the 3 after the 7, he actually takes a stance on this in his Nashr al-Qira'at al-Ashr, where he says, look, I used to think that these readings were mutawatira, as in every single one as a full system had tawatur. But I no longer see that. If you would try to prove tawatur for every single variant, even sometimes you're stuck with, like, for example, Hafs, he's the only one who reads kufuwan instead of kufu'an. Well, there's some who read kuf'an, but still. So he has a unique reading there, and it's like, well, does anyone else read it like that? Do we have any evidence for that? Do we see, do we have mass transmitted evidence for that? No, we just have one rawi from one transmission that says that. It's hard to make the argument that it's tawatur in the technical sense. At the same time, vast majority of the readings. Well, first of all, I mean, the vast majority of the words of the Quran, like, all the readers agree on. I mean, it's just we're talking about.
I think that's a crucial thing as well. So when we talk about the compiled reading, we should recognize that is. I haven't done a count how many thousands of words there are in the Quran.
70,000.
70,000.
Yeah.
Inshallah, it's like 70,000 angels. Anyway, so 70,000 words. And then a minority of those words have any variation at all.
Right.
So that's number one. Those are also in the qira'at, right? It doesn't become a qira'ah just when somebody else disagrees. It's a qira'ah when they agree as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, they differed on Maliki and Maliki, Yawmiddin. But Yawmiddin, they agreed on.
Right.
Well, except for when they didn't. Except for Malaka Yawmiddin, for example. Right. Ad-Din they agreed on. I don't think anyone had Ad-Din or something like that. So the point is the majority of words, vast majority of words, are actually matters of agreement. So the word tawatur probably could apply comfortably to those parts. In fact,
right.
I
Even
agree
in a
with
technical sense, yeah.
Muhammad Hassan Jabal, who makes an argument that basically the word tawatur falls way short of the transmission of the Quran. The Quran is like super tawatur. But when you're talking about how to pronounce some specific words, then again, there could be tawatur for the majority reading. But when there's a minority reading, and we only have that from one qari or one rawi, it's, you know, on what basis are you going to say that that particular pronunciation of that word is mutawatir? And this doesn't throw the whole system into chaos as people think, right? People think, oh, so then you're denying the tawatur of the qira'at, you're denying the tawatur of the Quran. You can do that if you want. I'm not I'm not getting into that territory, because for me it's like, I know that the word is there.
Right.
We're having a discussion about how that word is pronounced. That is not like the whole historicity and veracity of the Quran does not hinge on that. Like, what do I say about tasa'aluna bihi wal arhami? I must insist that wal arhami is mutawatir, otherwise everything will fall apart. Why can I not just say, well, the majority said tasa'aluna bihi wal arhama, and just relax? But I can certainly, there's, you know, this is ayah number 1 of Surat An-Nisa. Ibn Amir's reading famously was a locus for considerable criticism in the early period. But later on, it becomes established that, well, this is one of the readings. We don't criticize readings anymore. So all we'll do is focus on how this can be grammatically explained, and it can, and how it would be explained in terms of meaning and translation, and it can. But then how do we understand the approach of the earlier or the earliest scholars, like At-Tabari, who just went straight at it? The way I see it is, in fact, as Muslims, I think that we should conceive that the critique of qira'at is actually exactly how it is canonized, exactly how it is preserved, right? The whole process was one of assessment, evaluation, sifting, selecting what is best. Part of selecting what is best is rejecting what is not best, right? It's selecting the rajih over the marjuh, right? So that was still happening in the time of At-Tabari. And some maybe felt it could still happen even after, or a little bit after Ibn Mujahid, until it became almost taboo to do so. Because at the end of the day, I suppose the ummah has to move on. Just say, well, okay, these 7 qira'at, these 10 qira'at have won. We don't argue about them anymore. But still conceptually, one could still think, well, At-Tabari had a point in what he said about what arhami. And therefore, if I happen to be reciting according to the riwayah, you know, the qira'ah of Ibn Amir, I will say, well, arhami. I'm not, by the way, a reciter of the qira'at, I wish I were. But anyway, the point is, if I'm doing that one day, I would recite it correctly according to that riwayah. But that doesn't mean that I have to consider it to be equal to the other one. This kind of equal thing is an understandable position within, you know, on a practical level. But scholarship involves sometimes seeing nuances that are not sort of the general operational level. I mean, I could give a kind of comparison here to, for example, the books of hadith that have been, you know, accepted, and the general statement that is made, anything in these particular books, right? In particular, Al-Bukhari and Muslim, you know, we don't question anything in that, right? But then we see that scholars do sometimes question things in that, and conceptually that should always be possible. Like, there was at no point was the thing sent down from heaven, right? The Quran was sent down from heaven. The specific qira'at, like Ibn Amir does not have a proof for you that an angel came to him and told him, well, arhami, but he's received it, he's recited it that way, he's selected that way. He can be justified, he can be supported in that. But someone else can say, no, the reading should be, well, arhama. And this goes back all the way to the Sahaba. I don't know about this specific reading being a case like that, but you know, there are narrations that tell us Aisha heard, you know, somebody came and asked her about حتى إذا استيأس الرسل وظنوا أنهم قد كذبوا at the end, near the end of Surah Yusuf. And she said, it is كذبوا. كذبوا is the reading, right? And then she explained that in terms of the meaning, right? So the discussion wasn't all about, I heard it like this and I heard it like that, although it may well be that each of them heard it, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, may well have recited كذبوا and كذبوا. But Aisha did not hesitate to say, this is the way it is, right? And that is based on meaning, that is based on selection. So, yeah, I'm basically emphasizing here that critique of qira'at is fundamental to the preservation of qira'at, right? Because just like with hadith, and Ibn Juzay makes this point, Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, I did some presentations of his introductions to his tafsir, Tasheel li Ulum al-Tanzil. He gives this comparison right from the outset that the qira'at have to be analyzed and their exact nature determined, just like the dabt of hadith, right? So there's a lot to be made of this analogy, although there are obviously differences between qira'at and hadith. But the point is that it's open to selection and then sort of stabilization. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
No, I think it's good. I think we covered a lot of stuff here. I thought I maybe had something more to add to this. But,
well, I wanted to ask you maybe to say something about your critical edition.
Sure. Yeah. I also just remember what I wanted to say. So the first thing I wanted to say. So what's kind of interesting, once you take this kind of like lower resolution, higher up view of tawatur and qira'at and these kinds of things, what's kind of interesting about it is, like, if you start looking at early manuscripts, their specific combination of farsh, right? Specific combination of specific variants, generally are non-canonical, right? It doesn't look like any one of the readers, but the variants that they have, the vast majority of the time, are exactly the same readings that you find anywhere else. Every now and then you find something non-canonical, and then you're like, well, they must have chosen it for a reason. And indeed, if you start looking at it, those tend to make good sense as well, and you can make a point of that. And it's like, well, it is indeed a question of creating a canon, but already there was kind of the variation being talked about was already within that canon, right? So critical edition of the Quran. So this was a project I worked on a little bit during my, maybe I'll share my screen and just kind of scroll through it. It's been a project in development, and I've not been working on it that much because it was something I was doing. There we go. So what is a critical edition? People sometimes get the wrong impressions, like, well, you look at the Quran and then start criticizing it, and that's a critical edition.
Right.
There's a certain person who's made a critical edition of the Quran who certainly thought that was the case. But that's not what we're doing here, and that's not usually what we understand.
I scoffed because I remembered who you're talking about.
Right.
Right.
But that's not usually what we talk about. So a critical edition is looking at early manuscripts and comparing them against each other and figuring out what was the original text of the Quran. Now, the reason why I so boldly started doing this, because I thought it would be a fairly easy job to do. Which is true. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's not that hard. Why? Because the consonantal text of the Quran is pretty stable, and even the Cairo edition that we have today does a real attempt at getting close to the Uthmanic Rasm, so the original consonantal text as it was written down, presumably by the first scribes under Uthman. But get some things wrong, and not in any way that anyone cares. So people sometimes get angry at me when I say they get things wrong. I was like, and then I tell them, well, look, here and here, it's clear that all manuscripts are doing the same thing, And that's not something that the current print editions have. A good example of this would be dhu, the one of whatever, which in all early Quranic manuscripts is written dal, waw, alif. Waw today, if you open up your mushaf, you'll just find dal, waw. That's wrong. Doesn't have any influence on the meaning. I never said that.
Right.
But you know, if you want to know like what was the original text like, you start comparing manuscripts, you see what they do, the earliest ones that you can find, and kind of compare against each other. And you try to figure out, you choose the most likely original version of the text. And then you put a footnote and say, well, in this manuscript, I found this spelling, in this manuscript, I found that spelling. But you try to put like the most authoritative version of the text on there. Now,
but you're essentially
as I
trying
said,
to reconstruct the Uthmanic text, because
yes, yes, I am.
Unlike not necessarily like other academic scholars, but you tend to accept that there was an Uthmanic compilation, because that's the time checks out, and Islamic tradition attributes this to Uthman, and there's no reason to reject that, right? Did I understand that right?
Yes.
So then in that case, you'd get less criticism then if you just called it Uthmanic edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think
reconstruction of the Uthmanic.
Maybe so. I mean, so, and that's really what it is. So I should maybe consider.
Call it the Imam.
Right. But I should maybe actually consider that. So one thing, because that is the goal here, and there's actually a second kind of level of this that we could be doing, which would not be doing that. But we'll get into that in a second. So basically, I go through these texts, I make footnotes, and I put all the dots there. Not because I think that all these dots were necessarily there, but if there's no reason to think there was disagreement on these dots, I just put them there. And if there was disagreement between the qira'ats, either canonical or non-canonical, I will remove the dots there. But it's only 300 places where there's disagreement at all. So, I kind of go through it. I put some footnotes about this. And so that's, I've been working on it. I've been starting from the back because that's shorter and easier, and going to the front. And I'm specifically focusing on Uthmanic Qurans. That is, ones that are part of the standard text type. The standard text type, which definitely goes back very, very early.
Which is almost everything, right? In terms of what we have.
Yes. That's every single manuscript except for one. And then there's a couple that are kind of in betweenish. But, they're mostly Uthmanic anyway, and I include those, the ones that are in betweenish. But there's one that's different, and that's a Sana palimpsest, the lower text of the Sana palimpsest, which is a manuscript. The upper text is the Quran, it's perfectly canonical Quran, but a earlier text was washed off, and that earlier text was also Quran. And that text is pretty different. Not massively different, but wording can really be different. So most verses are in place. You'll recognize any verse. But every now and then the wording is just a little bit different here and there. And that's the kind of level of textual criticism that normal fields have to deal with without a very early canonization. Because we see similar kinds of reports for companions in the literary sources. And for the longest time, especially in Western academia, and I would say also actually in the early modern tradition in the East, there was some uncertainty about what to make of these variants of the companions. Were they just being made up? Were they just being used to make some kind of exegetical point? And then we found the Sana palimpsest, which had not sometimes actually literally had the variants that we saw reported for the companions, and sometimes typologically very similar. So that clearly shows that there was a truth to these kind of things. And what we could do is look at the Uthmanic text, but we would first have to know what is the actual Uthmanic text, and that's kind of what this is doing. And then start comparing, okay, we have the Uthmanic text here, we have this Ibn Mas'ud reading there, we have this form for the Sana palimpsest here. Which one is most likely to be original? And that gets into kind of strange situation. So part of the argument here is they are so close to one another that they actually all seem to be copied in some way from an earlier written form. This is Behnam Sadri's argument, and I basically accept that. But and that they were being copied from dictation, which suggests, there were some kind of, leaves around being written down in some kind of way, and these different variants were appearing. And the question becomes, well, which one is more original? But sometimes that question, especially in a kind of somewhat oral context that we think of in the early Islamic period, becomes basically meaningless, And sometimes you can really say, well, this is actually more likely to be original. This is less likely to be more original. And sometimes, well, it could be either, or it could be both, right? Yeah. Both is actually an option.
The traditional account would be raising points about how people would sometimes write down for their individual purpose, right? So that's one type of variation where there isn't an original. Then they're writing down something oral.
Right.
Also, there are accounts, of course, of different. You used the word leaves. I know you didn't mean leaves as leaves, but literally leaves or bones or things like that. And an earlier stage of compilation, which is Abu Bakr's Suhuf, which was a written collection as well before we get to Uthman's project. So there is scope to understand and interpret where something like the slightly different text in Sana'a comes up. Aside from obviously what some people try to sidestep the issue, I would say, by just saying, well, maybe it's somebody made mistakes and then they just wiped the whole, they made so many mistakes that they just wiped the whole thing out and started again. Or someone came and found this horrible, copy and just said, I'm going to wipe this out and, reuse this paper. So those are theories that are advanced. I know that you don't have much sympathy for them. That's a scholarly debate that can take place. But I'm just pointing to the fact that from an Islamic perspective, we're not necessarily bound to say, for example, that this was a mistake. I mean, the idea that it was something that was written down as Qur'an at the time when it was written fits within certain things that we have within our traditional accounts, right?
And that still need not discount the fact that eventually the Muslim community agreed on a standard text. And I mean, that's the other side. I mean, we have to keep in mind that this text was erased and overwritten with the standard text. I think that is actually considerable evidence in favor of this idea that actually Uthman said, look, we have a standard text now, get rid of your old text, we're going to stick to this now. Well, that's what seems to have happened with this manuscript. So for the
most part, what we understand is that other copies, unauthorized copies, were instructed to be burned. But it could be that some of that was simply washed over, to preserve good materials. Right. And we know that there's a longer story with Ibn Mas'ud's reading and copy. So let's maybe shift towards our topic of tawjih and
let's do it.
Translation. So we are going to get into this. We can maybe start here. This was the presentation that we delivered in Palermo, but we were so rushed. I think you've changed it now, but one of the slides actually said, ask us in the break about this one because we wanted to find some chance of talking about it. But we had to talk at speed really and could hardly introduce the two translations that we were also referring to.
At high speed, and even still we were not able to really cover everything. It was a bit frustrating, but that's the way it goes.
Yeah, so we've talked about this now in the process of our discussion, canonization of texts and readings. So these reading traditions, we mean like from beginning to end of the Quran, according to a certain combination of usul and farsh, right? The 7 and the 10. Within Islamic tradition, there's a position which is accepted that there's no one reading that is like the reading. Right, so even though the reading of Hafs from Asim has become so dominant, it doesn't mean that at any point anyone has made an argument that it is the main reading of the Quran. It remains one of the readings. And in
some
terms
have
of
made the arguments that it's the only reading of the Quran, but yeah, that's certainly not a mainstream position.
some made the argument.
Yeah.
Yes, and but that's been made sort of in reverse.
Right.
So Hafs didn't become dominant because of an argument, as far as we can trace. We don't have anything historically like that. But there are some now who sort of look at that dominance and then try to explain it with some kind of post hoc argument, which I think neither of us have any sympathy with, to be honest. Well, I certainly will say I find it completely ahistorical. Mainly what I say about qira'at is based not only on reading books about qira'at and ulum al-Qur'an and so on, but also just observing the practice of the mufassirin, how they took things, how they understood things. So some people have tried to say, well, there was a general reading, right? Qira'at al-amma. There was something that all the general public was reading, and that, as it happens, is basically the same or exactly the same as Hafs and Asim as we have it today. But just does not stack up. Really, it doesn't stack up really in any way, shape, or form. And yes, so a minority of these changes affect meaning, and they address in tafsir and tawjih work. So I mentioned tafsir. I briefly mentioned tawjih as well. We can go into this a little bit more here. So there is this genre of works which address on the one hand, you've got certain works which are concerned only with the canonical readings, and then you've got some other works that deal with non-canonical readings, but they tend to be sort of dealing with these, separately, right? But to an extent, some works can incorporate both together. So before we get to what we would call the tawjih genre, you've got what we've kind of termed proto-tawjih works, because the title of these works is not really about the qira'at as such. You've got books which are called Marijn al-Qur'an. You've got books which are called Avoidable Qur'an, or some combination of these names. But they contain a lot of the material concerning the qira'at, concerning their grammatical interpretation and their meanings as well, which then are quoted by the later works. So classical here, we mean sort of, it takes its form at this point as a genre of tawjih al-qira'at as such. So this is where I've got that shelf that I pointed to behind me. The physical ones that I have are there. الكتاب المختار, الحجة في القراءات السبع, or الحجة للقراء السبعة of الفارسي, إعراب القراءات السبع وعللها, and معاني القراءات. So I like the spread of words here. I like the word hujja, the word ilal, and the word ma'ani, right? So that kind of reflects several things that are going on, right? So ilal is kind of saying, why is this reading like this? But not necessarily arguing for it. Hujja or ihtijaj al-qira'at gives you more an impression that what a person would be trying to do here is say, well, here is a defense and a justification, an advocacy for a particular reading, right? It's not necessarily the case. The word ihtijaj can be used a bit more broadly, but the word implies that. That's all I'm saying. And then ma'ani al-qira'at relates back to what ma'ani al-Qur'an. The same kind of thing is going on, where the readings are looked at, and this is the implication that it has for meaning. In reality, all these books have roughly the same kind of content, right? It's not that the Ma'ani book is completely different from the other books.
I think just worth adding here, what's kind of interesting about this classical tawjih generation. It all, you know, if you even look at the authors, you know, they die like 369, 370, 370, 377.
Yes.
This is really a genre that popped up in its recognizable form right after Ibn Mujahid. And even so Al-Farisi and Ibn Khalaway are those only two were direct students of Ibn Mujahid. So they were concerned in taking the seven basically and kind of going through it. And even so Al-Farisi's book quotes Ibn Mujahid in its completeness. And then after every variant that is being mentioned by Ibn Mujahid, he says, well, you know, the one who reads it like this means this and this and this. The one who reads it like that means that and that and that. His book is, I find, quite hard to read, but it's very, very detailed. But yeah.
And again, these, along with Al-Farra and others from the early stage, become you know, the basis for some of the later works, which when we've described it as late, it's not because, as I recall, that there's any particular change in the way they address the topic. It's just that they don't have that direct connection to the, you know, to Ibn Mujahid and that time period. They're coming a little bit later, where the matter is more established. But then, interestingly, this genre pretty much then seems to disappear as far as what I've been able to see. Of course, I'm relying here on, you know, the work done by Arabic manuscript scholars, editors who are finding the manuscripts and publishing things for us and letting us know about what's going on in them. But as far as the information that we have at the current time, it does seem to sort of stop being a distinct genre at this time. Already, it's existing alongside tafsir, and this kind of material is found in tafsir at that period as well. After this time, whether this is related or not, I don't know, but this is roughly, you know, a bit after this time is where Zamakhshari's tafsir emerges, and of course that becomes a major phenomenon in tafsir. Maybe people just felt you deal with this in the tafsir genre and there's no need for a separate genre. But naturally, this is something which, you know, it requires a lot of attention. Like, you need to give attention to tawjih literature in order to really start talking about the qira'at and their meanings. So there was an earlier presentation that I did. You can find it on this same YouTube channel, Ibn Ashur Center. I'll need to check, or if not, then I'll add it, because I did it for the Global Qur'an project. Let me just share something a little bit different here. This was the presentation that I did towards the canonical translation of the Qur'an. So in a way, like, you talked about a critical edition, and the idea there is to kind of whittle down and limit to what is sort of the intended, not necessarily intended reading, but your intended writing is what you're focused on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But I don't know what position you would then take on whether that writing reflects one reading, or whether that writing was already supposed to incorporate more than one reading. Do you have a position on that?
Yeah, I have a bit of position on it, so I can do a couple of thoughts. I think in principle that the intention was not to necessarily include different readings. I think I certainly think that, you know, the couple of readings that Abu has that don't agree with the Rasm, I don't think they intended to include those because they don't fit, right? And at the same time, the way the script worked at the time, there were no vowel signs yet. It was an unavoidability. I don't doubt that some of this variation already existed before the canonization. There was more variation, but some of the variation probably just existed. I think there's a good chance that a bunch of it was generated after the canonization because multiple readings were possible. You know, so was the intention? No, I think the intention was to just write one Quran. It's just the script didn't allow for one Quran. In the same way that, even if you take a papyrus from the same period, from the 1st century, you can read that in a couple of different ways. And I mean, so technically you could say, a text document has multiple qira'at, which would not be wrong, but it's just it's a side effect of the thing. But I don't think it's necessarily an unwanted side effect of the canonization. I don't think, well, I mean, it's hard to, you can't even conceptualize this. They didn't have grammatical theory in that sense. They didn't have vowels. They didn't have, well, they did have the dots, but they didn't write them as often. So they didn't have this conceptualization of, well, if you write it like this, well, then suddenly you'll be able to read this in a passive, and that's no good. So no, that's just, that's the way it was, and that's the way it works. That's kind of my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to how what we see was happening in the earliest stage. Of course, we've got to factor in here the hadiths about al-ahruf al-sab'a, some explicit accounts of how reading variation was accepted, has a basis in revelation and divine instruction. So based on that, I think some of the nice term that's been used by Yasin Dutton, for example, is a multiform Qur'an. And then when it comes to the practice of the scholars, there's this tension between two things that they're doing simultaneously, which is limiting but accepting plurality. So that's what I was saying before, when they did ikhtiyar of a particular reading, they were clearly preferring something, but they weren't necessarily criticizing the others. But at times they were. So that can then affect the question of, like, what should our attitude be to variation that we find, like, from an interpretation perspective. So a reductive approach, would be to say, here I can bring up this kind of slide here, because I want to talk about not just with regards to translation, but in general about an attitude towards the multiplicity, where you could have a very reductive approach where you're kind of saying only one of these is right according to me, and I just need to determine which one I think it is, right? And if I have strong enough evidence for that, then I can be certain. Otherwise, I'll just have to say, this is what I think is the right one. So that's where you see qira'at is about a kind of indeterminacy, right? Just like when in the proliferation of the manuscripts, there can variations creep in, maybe because of errors or idiosyncrasies in somebody's writing style. And then you're trying to trace back, okay, but what do I think was the original intended one? Right? Because you think that one was intended. In qira'at, I don't necessarily think that only one was intended. I think that, a multiplicity was intended, and even at times the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, would have recited things in more than one way. I don't hold to the assumption or the position or the insistence that all the variations that we have within the qira'at, have that status as something that directly was, that came from his mouth. Because if we go to that point of view, it opens up a whole load of questions that are very difficult to deal with, such as, how do we conceive of this actually happening and being, realized within the life and the career and the busyness of the Prophet in regards to all he was doing. He was not, he was teaching the Qur'an, but was he, teaching the qira'at like a qira'at teacher does, full time now? With all the variations, did he do jam' al-qira'at, or did, how many times did he deliver it in different ways to each people? And then we can't even say, okay, that he did it 7 times in 7 different ways. I don't mean the ahruf here, I mean the qira'at, right? Or 10 different ways. These, as we said before, are combinations of possibilities. So there's got to be a certain extent that there was a role for people realizing things according to the principles that were established in that early stage, and within the scope of permission, rukhsa as they say, and dispensation for ease for them. Then when it came to the scholarly process of gathering these things and sifting through them, they had the principles to establish what are the strongest ways of reading. And yet, even at this stage, the allowance for multiplicity, the allowance for more than one possibility. But you see, on the other side is the pluralistic approach. And you know what I'm trying to say. The pluralistic approach can also go to a kind of extreme, right? So I think a nice way to illustrate this could be, if I just go to here, this is a thread. After talking about this wall that was on the verge of collapsing, in Surat Al-Kahf, there is then the verse where Musa, peace be upon him, says to Al-Khadr, قال لو شئت لتخذت عليه أجرا, right? That's the most famous reading. Okay, but then this word is also realized in another way. قال لو شئت لتخذت عليه أجرا. Here I was just pretending to be you. I made a table of these readings. So we've got لتخذت or لتخذت, depending on how you deal with the dhal and the ta. And this is the group of readers who form it from تخذ. And then the others have اتخذ, لتخذت or لتخذت, depending on how you realize the second part, right? But basically this is one group. Hafs and Shu'bah, so is the reading of Asim, Nafi', Abu Ja'far, Ibn Amir, Al-Kisai, Hamza, Khalaf. So a majority there. And then on the other side from Takhida, Ibn Kathir, and then both from Yaqub and Abu Amr, right? So 3 out of the 10. So ittakhadha is common throughout the Quran. Some say it is formed from takhida. I know you have thoughts about this. You can share it in a moment.
Yeah.
So takhida itself has been used by some of the Arabs as a verb with the same meaning as akhada, to take. And I noticed that it fits the rasam more closely. But you were telling me that perhaps not, if you take into account, maybe in your critical edition, you're going to end up with an alif.
Yes, it might end up with an alif.
Yeah. Whereas in our edition, the Cairo edition, as it were, it is written like this, right? Whether you read لتخذت or لتخذت, is written like this without the alif, based on what they based their copy on. So I said either the Prophet, peace be upon him, recited it in both ways, or it was accepted within the ease granted in the period of revelation. Then it conformed with the rules for an accepted reading, including language and orthography. Here, I'm being non-committal about the question, because some people will say that I must insist that if it's like this in the qira'at sab'ah, then definitely that came in that way from the mouth of the Prophet, peace be upon him. This insistence is just not what our qira'at scholarship is based on. It's not the way that the compilation of qira'at took place, or the way that it was rationalized and justified. It is not the way the mufassirin talk. It is a particularly, I want to say, modern type of assumption or assertion, which maybe fits within a type of apologetic context where you're trying to just have a lot of certainty about certain things, which again is not the way that our scholarship has proceeded, right? So I'm fine with saying maybe the Prophet recited لَتَّخَذْتَ on one occasion and لَتَخِذْتَ on another occasion. I have no problem with that at all. But I don't need to believe that for me to accept both of them as qira'at, because I believe that there was a certain scope of permission which these fall into. And if both of them make sense, if both of them fit the rules, not just of language, but also conformity to the orthography of the Quran, and they are transmitted, and they have been received and accepted, so then I accept them, right? So I said if we want to know how scholars understood and spoke about them, we would read these genres, right? That's the crucial point that I'm making here. And here's a nicer picture. The ones on the right are kind of more the earlier works that we talked about. And then on the left, these are actually modern works, So we said that the genre dropped off, but then in a way picked up again in modern times when now we have, publishing and new ways of writing. So these are just basically compilations from what's been said in the early stage. Crucial. One of the basic principles the scholars followed is to start with the assumption that the readings agree in meaning. It was al-aslu tawafuq al-qira'at. So they would start there. They wouldn't start by saying the meanings. So the qira'at have, each one is intended in and of its own right. And therefore we should look at each one and separately determine what it means. And we should try to make them diverge. Instead, they sought in the first place to say, well, how are these meanings the same? How are these readings the same? Or if they're not the same, then how are they complementary? In a more positive sense, they often talk about the meanings the various readings provide. That's what we said in Marijn al-qira'at generally. We can take from this that the openness of the text is a source of richness and pondering. What they didn't suggest, however, is that all canonical readings are equally intended at all places at the same time. They didn't insist on laying out the variants and make them fit together in one account. So I'm going to show you how this happened in this particular verse. Okay, we're going to be talking about the British translation today. They made a variant. لتخذت, they translated it, if you wanted, you could have charged a reward for it. And they did لتخذت as if you had wanted, you could have taken a reward for it. Right? So some features of this translation, we're going to talk about it later, but you can see here, he mentions the readers who did the other one, but what's not mentioned is the Arabic word, which is a bit of a annoyance for someone who's trying to actually follow the various qira'at, because it doesn't tell you what the actual word of the other reading is. So I don't think that works. I go into the reasons here. The difference between taken and charged is arbitrary. But there's also this book in Arabic, اتساع الدلالات في تعدد القراءات القرآنية. It's written by Mahanna and Wadi, and it's been overviewed by Bassam Jarrar. Look at what they ended up saying here. They consider that what happened is both of these qira'ats reflect something that happened in the story. So they say first, Musa said in a sort of gentle way, قال لو شئت لتخذت عليه أجرا. And then it's like Al-Khadr was ignoring him, kept on building. So then he sort of لو شئت لتخذت عليه أجرا. So he used like a stronger word as if to express his annoyance or anger. If you think I'm making this up, it's all here. دلالة تعدد القراءة تبين القراءتان أن موسى اقترح الأمر مرتين، مرة في بداية الأمر على استحياء، وفي الثانية بعدما رأى اكتمال البناء وإتقان العمل من الرجل الصالح قال لاتخذت. And I said it gets crazy, this Musa recited both ways, like he was reciting his life with Jam' al-Qira'at. And I said it's a bid'ah, right? That's a strong word from a Muslim. Innovation, just absolutely unsupported in our tafsir tradition, and just nonsensical. It's nonsensical. At the end of the day, you've got to say, first of all, Musa was not talking in Arabic. So the idea is in whatever language he was speaking, Hebrew or something, then he was using some equivalent where he said it gently and then he said it strongly. And why was Al-Khadr that didn't hear him or something? We're going to start to invent details of the story. He just ignored him, and then قال هذا فراق بيني وبينك, because now he's spoken loudly to him. All of this is just completely baseless, completely it's appalling. It's appalling proposition. They created a contradiction, then tried to solve it. This is about the language. And I wanted to point out, like, they themselves know that they're doing something novel, but they obviously thought it was worth doing. They also thought Musa objected twice to the boy's killing. he first called him nafs zakiya, and then he got more angry about it and said nafsan zakiya. Interestingly, in this other, I won't go into it now, but I've got this other thread about fanadaha min tahtiha or man tahtaha. Interestingly, in that one, they didn't do this. They could have said Jibril called out to her and the baby called out to her, but they didn't do that. I do something like that, by the way, but in a subtle way.
And it should be said that those are actually opinions that existed, right? So if you look at the tafsirs, and I think even Al-Farra does it, right? He says, well, I always forget which one. So min tahtiha must be baby Jesus, right? And man tahti, or it's the other way around. Well,
yeah, it's not
that obvious to me.
But it's the other way around. But right. Actually, but different scholars had different directions on it. Some authorities, min tahtiha is Jibril, man tahtaha is Isa. Mm-hmm. But then later on, this ittisa' dilalat, they've got that the baby then called out with all these multiple qira'at about how the dates are going to fall. Tusaqat, tasaqat, tasaqat, yassaqat. Right, so his baby mouth was also articulating all these different qira'at in whatever language
with full tajweed, of course.
So yeah, this is what happens when you this is pluralism on steroids, mm-hmm. right? Where in a very particular modern twist, people are saying the multiple readings should be considered not just complementary, but like there is a meaning that comes from combining the readings together, and that even if that changes the whole story, right? Even if that changes the whole story. So ways that you could approach qira'at in translation. The basic idea here is a normative approach. Much as I've been criticizing something we would call hafs-normativity, right? That is to act as if there's only one reading, and that's hafs. But most translations have followed a normative approach, and that means to say they translate hafs as if it's the only reading. As long as one is aware that one is doing it, then okay. Like if your point is people read according to hafs, so I'll translate hafs. That's a reasonable proposition. But maybe in other regions where they're reading Nafi', for example, we should translate Nafi'. So we do have an example of the Bewley's translation. Aisha and Abdurrahman Bewley, they translated the Quran according to Nafi', even though they're in England. But the point was they believe in a Medinan Islam, and so the Maliki madhab and the qira'ah of Nafi' and the Muwatta and the Shifa of Qadi Iyad, so Andalusian is counted in this as well. So based on that, they translated the Quran according to Nafi'. That's a normative approach as well, you could say, right? A critical approach would be to say, like the early exegetes did. They, like Tabari, for example, when they come to a particular qira'ah, a point of variance, they would say, وَأَوْلَى الْقِرَاءَاتِ عِنْدِي قِرَاءَةُ مَنْ قَرَأَ بِالْفَتْحِ. So they would say, like, the one that I prefer out of all of these is, for example, the reading with fath, because more readers went with that, or because the meaning is better, or whatever it may be. So sometimes you do get translators who use this approach, and it can be a bit surprising. There are examples in Yusuf Ali, near the beginning and near the end of Surat Al-Anbiya. He translates qala as if it's qul, and he basically says, well, the other qira'ah is qul, and I'm translating according to that because it's clearer. Even Professor Abdul Halim does this in at least one place, and notes it in his footnote that he's used the other qira'ah. Now, by the way, I only found this out recently because our friend Dr. Haytham Sidqi told me, he pointed out to me in Abdul Halim's translation. And this actually caused me some amazement, because my own story with translating qira'at goes back when I was enlisting as a PhD student at SOAS. And my proposal on which I was accepted was entitled The Impact of the Canonical Readings of the Quran on Translation, or Canonical Readings on Translation of the Quran. So naturally, this shows you that my interest goes back a while, and I wanted to really develop a theoretical basis where a table like where we were just looking at is reflective of that theoretical approach, to consider how should the qira'at be taken into account, and then actually to do the project and to see the changes that happen, right? As it turns out, I was not the person who got the honor of being the first one to do this in English. And indeed, it has been done also in Japanese soon after me starting my PhD. But you see, when I presented this to Professor Abdul Halim as my project, he was really not sympathetic to the topic. He didn't like it. I think he basically indicated to me that qira'at have no relevance to translation. And I didn't realize at the time I would have used this as a gotcha, that he actually, in at least one place, changes the translation according to the qira'at. And in other places, by the way, whether he knew it or not, switched to a different qira'ah, right? So, for example, he doesn't tell you under حتى إذا استيأس الرسل وظنوا أنهم قد كذبوا, that he's actually translated كذبوا. He doesn't tell you that under فنجي من نشاء, I think he has translated فننجي من نشاء, right? So did he do that on purpose or not? I don't know. But what I know is that he doesn't mention it in the footnote. So qira'at do have an impact on translation. And sometimes we find that there are some scholars who took a sort of critical approach by selecting a different qira'ah where they felt that Hafs, their default, was not conducive, or something else was sort of better fitting the context as they saw it. An inclusive approach would be, you basically have one translation where you try to, you're looking at the agreement of the readings, and you're trying to translate according to a way that allows this overlap to happen. But oftentimes it's not possible. There are some variants where you just can't do one translation in English that is going to get both meanings, or indeed in any language, right? So with قال إبراهيم لأبيه آزر or لأبيه آزر, either he's the name of the father, or you could say, some understand it to be the uncle, but whatever, the name of Abihi is Azar, or it's not, right? So some of them understood it as the name of the idol or something like that. So these cannot be encompassed in one translation. You have to make a choice as to how you understand it. And then the pluralist approach is to deliberately highlight divergencies, and that's where we get into these works. Shall I pass over to you to introduce us maybe to the Japanese work to start with?
Yeah, sure. So we looked at two of these works, and our project was basically to look at Surat al-An'am and see not only how these two works translated it. So one of them is the Matsuyama Yohei's Nichiya Taiyaku Kuruan Tsuki Yakkai to Seito Judoku Juchu Kai. This is a very long title, but a very nice Japanese translation. Well, I'm not sure it's nice, but it's very literal and very complex. I have it here actually with me, which not just gives a translation of the Quran in the first place of the Hafs reading, but then has a appendix in the back where every single place where a different reading would have given a different translation, the different translation is given. And so we look at that and kind of looked at how this translation approached it. And we looked at Father Suleiman's translation, the British translation of the qira'at of the Noble Quran, which has a very similar strategy in that it gives the Hafs translation first and foremost, also prints, both of them actually prints the Hafs text in the manuscripts. And then gives footnotes, highlights in red, which is I quite like when there's a junction in difference in reading, and then in a footnote says what the different readers would be translated as. Sadly, it does not mention what the different form would be, which is different from the Japanese version, which does tell you what the different forms are, goes into considerable detail at times, and I believe the translation of the appendix then comes with extra footnotes again. So there's really quite a bit of layering to this. And we kind of looked at this like, okay, well, how have they approached it? So, you know, I know a bit of Japanese. I started picking it up again when we started working on this project.
Yeah.
So it's been a bit of a detail, and people who've been following me on Twitter have certainly seen me every now and then ask, hey, how would you translate this? Or does this say what I think it says? And that was because I was looking at this and wasn't sure whether I was translating it correctly. What was I going to say about this? And what we did was like kind of evaluate these, see how they went about translating these variants, and whether we could agree with some of the choices made or differently, and how the tawjih works could give us insight into how to translate these kinds of things. And we kind of made a comparison. Maybe you want to pick up from here, Suhaib?
Yeah, just to like this is the rundown really of the junctures that we looked at and felt or agreed that there is a variation in meaning on some level, and so here we've transliterated it, and then we have these two columns for each of the translations, just commenting on an evaluation of how they did, right? So a lot of times you see I say both reasonable, some of them had a reasonable variation, some of them ignored a particular reading which is also reasonable, because we're not coming from a point of view where you have to force a difference between the readings. If you can just reconcile that with one translation, that's fine. But then we also noted some errors, sometimes in the 2014 project, but a larger number in the 2020 project. I'll sort of scroll through this. I'm not going to go through all the details because we're going to pick out a few things to indicate, but you know, if somebody wants to kind of pause the video and maybe study these in more detail, then you are very free to do so. But these are the brief comments that we have on the way that the readings have been handled, and based on this, a very, very rough numerical figure that we could give as a percentage figure, just to give an idea about the sort of extent of accuracy in rendering the qira'at. So we gave the Japanese project a 90% success rate and the English project a 70% success rate. And I'll leave it to the viewer to decide, you know, what success rate is important to you when you're reading a work on the Quran, and are you happy with something that is wrong, like wrong 30% of the time. But the British translation, I want to say something about it as well before we get into saying some more negative things about it. I want to contextualize this a bit, partly because Ustad Fadl Suleiman is very dear to me. In fact, is a wonderful person. He's met both of us in person, Marijn, before we met each other, actually. And this project, the British translation, you know, it's, as it was first conceived, was not about the qira'at, but the qira'at aspect got tacked on and then became part of even the title of the work. But originally, the concept here was about sort of translating literally, or as literally as possible, in order to preserve as much as possible of the features and quirks of the source text of the Quran. That way, a person, when reading the translation, will notice some of the types of variation between nouns and verbs, between singular and plural, between present and past tense, and so on. So that was the kind of approach, and that in and of itself, I don't think is my ideal approach to translation. But given that we have so many translations and we have, many dozens of translations in English, I actually do welcome someone doing something a little bit differently, because it adds something to the the options that we have, right? So occasionally we actually need, for example, when I'm teaching something about tafsir, I might have to say, well, literally this means such and such and such, but the idiom is like this. So it's helpful to have something to say, well, literally this was probably giving you the thing that I want to say, that literally it means this. Literally laysa kamithlihi shay, literally there's nothing like his likeness, right? Do the translations say that? A lot of times they will change it up to something like there's nothing at all like him, right? Which is fine. But then actually I think there is something to be said for that literal meaning, nothing like his likeness. So I didn't check what he's got here, but that's the kind of thing that he would pay attention to. So that being said, really, and as you know, because of my own sort of background and interest in the subject, some people might do a psychoanalysis of me and say, oh, he's a hater because someone beat him to it. And maybe on some level, I can't deny I have a human nafs, which is subject to all these things. But really, anyone who's sort of involved in the field on a scholarly level, if you were to read the introduction to this work, it will be clear that this is not sort of based on the right sources, scholarship, and conceptualization of the subject. You'll find in the introduction, it conflates between ahruf, qira'at, and dialects, as if they're basically all the same thing. It does say in the introduction that it is based on works like Ruh al-Ma'ani of al-Alusi, al-Tahrir al-Tanwir by Ibn Ashur, and older tafsirs as well. The books on qira'at are sorely lacking in terms of the references. It doesn't contain anything from tawjih al-qira'at. But even in terms of the tafsirs, there's many occasions where it is clear that the translator did not go back to the tafsirs to establish what was meant there, right? And sometimes he has theories which are really very divergent from the way that it's been understood in the past. So, for example, one that's given in the introduction, and the translator also sometimes mentions in his talks, فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ, and the other reading, فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٌ. If you go to the books of tawjih and tafsir, they will simply say, تَلَقَّى, although oftentimes we translate it as Adam received words from his Lord. When it happens in the other direction, you can't say words from his Lord received Adam. But Ustad Fadil wants to do that. And then he sort of, from that, creates a narrative that this means that his repentance has to be accepted as well. Right? So the words receive him. This is not the meaning. This is not what scholars understood. And who is it? Ibn Kathir or Al-Kisa'i? I forget, something with a K in it.
Ibn Kathir, I think.
Ibn Kathir is فَتَلَقَّى آدَمَ مِنْ رَبِّهِ الْكَلِمَاتُ. I promise you that Ibn Kathir, the reciter, was not thinking that at all, right? And if he was not thinking that at all, then khalas, nobody should be suggesting that that's the meaning. Until at least maybe take this and show that idea to some ulama and get some feedback about it. But personally, I think it doesn't make sense at all. All they say is talaqqa is a two-way kind of thing, like meeting, right? So just as Adam talaqqa al-kalimat, then al-kalimat talaqqa or talaqqat Adam, right? So that's how they explain it. That's what I'm telling you, right? If you have another explanation and you want to add something to tawjih scholarship, then you got to rise to that challenge. Take the other example in Surat النمل ألا يسجدوا لله, and the other reading ألا يسجدوا لله. So here, anyone who goes back to the tafsir works will clearly see that they did not understand it as why don't they prostrate? ألا يسجدوا لله. Because the problem with that is, then it would be ألا يسجدون لله, right? Instead, they had to go to quite a complicated explanation, which is ألا, which is like for tanbih, and then ya, which is for nida originally, but here for kind of tanbih as well. ألا ya, and then usjudu as fi'lu amr. ألا ya usjudu lillah, which is like, hey everyone, listen up, prostrate to God. So that's a bit complicated, but it's the only way you can really do takhrij and explain that reading, given that there is no noon. But the British translation here jumps to a conclusion, whereas what they should have done is, of course, review the tawjih works at every point, or if not the tawjih works, then tafsir works.
A very nice example, of course, because this is the reading of Al-Kisai, Ala Yashjudu, and we have Marijn Qur'an by Al-Farra, who was his direct student. So he tells you how to interpret this, right? So it's very rare for us to have access to direct insight into how any of these readers understood the readings. And in this case, we have like, well, not a first-hand, but a second-hand report of actually how the reader understood this reading. Which is cool, and we should exploit that much more often, because it's really exciting to be able to actually get insight like that.
So I think then we've got some cases that we extracted from our An'am study of avoidable errors, and our point here isn't just about reviewing these translations and saying, oh, they got this wrong or they got this wrong and watch out for this, or refuting or canceling anybody, right? Our purpose is to say, right, what can we learn from this? What can we then establish as stronger practice? But essentially, like, how do they shed some light on actually what's going on with the qira'at and with tawjih al-qira'at? Right, so this is your slide.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So this is a difference in reading, and it's actually a difference in the rasm between the Syrian Uthmanic Codex and the other codices. So you get وَلَدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ or وَلَدَّارُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ. And the Japanese translation doesn't have a different translation. So what it comes down to is akhirah, is that the adjective of dar, and are they both definite, or are dar and akhirah in construct with one another, in which case akhirah isn't an adjective, but it's a noun, which means the hereafter. And the Japanese translation translates raise no sumai koso, which is raise no sumai is the abode of the hereafter, or you know, the home of the hereafter. Which is actually an excellent translation of the Ibn Amr translation. It's not that good for the like a majority reading, which would mean like the final home, or the final abode, or however you want to translate it, which seems like it should have been translatable into Japanese, like something like Saigo no Sumai, but it doesn't. Not sure why. It's, I think, defensible to translate it. I think in both cases, more or less the same thing is done, but it's totally possible to translate two different things.
And
now,
so you're not necessarily saying that okay, these are necessarily divergent meanings, but it's more that if your project is to showcase the difference, then this is one that should have been showcased.
You could, yes, I think so. And then the British translation does something strange, because it translates the home of the hereafter is definitely better for the first one, which should be, you know, the final abode is better. And the second one, the home of the hereafter is better, which is the one well, that's an okay translation, that works out. But the first one doesn't make any sense. And it seems to be like, indeed, it's rather that the British translation understood not the definite article being absent in the first case and present in the first case and absent in the second case, but rather the la. So what do you call that? The asseverative la is how I call it. Was present in the first and absent in the second, but that's not what it says. So it seems like Father Suleiman's translated وَلَدَارُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ and وَدَارُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ, which is neither of them. Well, no, neither of them is Quran. No, the second one, the first one is, I guess, yeah. So, well, that could have been avoided by looking at how these things were explained, but also just looking very carefully about which lam is being dropped out and which is not, which is not what happened in the translation here. Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that happens a number of times in the British translation around things like the word تذكرون here. لعلكم or لعلكم تذكرون. So the first one, تذكرون, right? So where we've got this geminated or doubled ذال, تذكرون, versus لعلكم تذكرون. One may look at it and see, okay, there's a difference. There's a difference in the sound, in the shape of the word. So there could be different forms, different verb forms, right? But in fact, on closer looking, they are the same form, right? They're both, what number do we call this again? Form 5,
Form
right?
5,
Where you've got the asl of it, where it comes from is تتذكرون, تتذكرون. And then that's realized either as تذكرون with removing the first ta, okay, or maybe there's debate over which ta, but one of the tas
there is
right? So then it becomes تذكرون. But the other way of realizing this is to merge the second ta into the dal and becomes تذكرون. So those are in fact the same word. تتذكرون and تذكرون and تذكرون are exactly the same word. Therefore, their meaning should not differ, right?
Yeah.
And if there is any difference, we have to consider it to be extremely subtle. Like we could say, what is the wisdom, the balaghi wisdom for this word being used in this place or this word being used in that way? Maybe. But when you have multiple readings of the same word, it's hard to say that, there's a wisdom of this over that because, each of the qurra was operating according to their own wisdom. We could say, why is it not لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَذَكَّرُونَ? Well, it's definitely not that because it's only one ta. But between these two, there is no difference. Whereas in the British translation, we have so that you may remember, and this one so that you may remind yourselves. So trying to sort of reconstruct what's happened here, although I could just ask, but trying to reconstruct academically what's happened here is as if he's got a sense of reflexiveness from the tashdid, right? As if it was the difference between tudhakkir and tatadhakkar, right? But even then, of course, if he's understood tadhakkarun as remember, then this is kind of an artificial distinction, which I don't know exactly what form that he thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
The next one I think is in my slate as well. فَتَفَرَّقَ بِكُمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ. Very similar situation here. Originally تَتَفَرَّقَ, and then two ways of realizing that is by removing the ta altogether or merging them together, right? So فَتَفَرَّقَ بِكُمْ or بِكُمُ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ and فَتَفَرَّقَ. Again, there is no difference between these two word forms, right? There's a difference in the pronunciation, but morphologically speaking, there is no difference. Here in the translation, فَتَفَرَّقَ, lest they divert you from his way, which is fine. فَتَفَرَّقَ, lest they divert with you from his way. So there we go. So what's happening here is
Sorry.
these are actually two different ways of understanding, تفرق بكم عن سبيلي, but the difference doesn't come from the difference in qira'ah, right? Divert you, if you take the ba as just for ta'diyah, or divert with you, if you kind of understand it, that those paths will divert and you will go with them. You can understand it that way. But the difference is not coming from the two qira'at. The difference is coming according to translation strategy of the expression itself. All right, I'm going to sit back. This is a biggie.
Yeah, so this is a very complex one. Once again, this is actually a variant reading that we see between the Syrian Mus'haf and the other Mus'hafs. So the majority reading is وَكَذَلِكَ زَيَّنَ لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُم, or أَوْلَادِهِمُ and شُرَكَاؤُهُم. I'm being very pedantic by adding those, but I think it's important. Which translates pretty obviously. I mean, it's complex syntax, but you get something like, likewise to many of the polytheists, their associates have beautified the killing of their children. But then we have this other reading, the reading of Ibn Amr, which is وَكَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلُ أَوْلَادَهُمْ شُرَكَائِهِمْ. And I put 3 question marks here because the question is like, how does that even translate?
So let's just to maybe break this down for people. But so in the first way, zayyana is an active verb, so it will have its agent, its fa'il, right, which in the mainstream, the majority reading is shuraka'uhum. So beautified for many of the polytheists. Who has done this? The associates have done so, right? And what have they beautified? قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ, the killing of their children, i.e. the children of the mushrikeen, right? So in this majority reading, that's the way it is. زَيَّنَ شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ لِلْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ, right? So قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ is a مضاف and مضاف إليه. It's a genitive construct where the expectation is the two units of it must be together. And the other reading of Ibn Amr, وَكَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ, is now a passive verb. So we don't have to have, now we're not going to have the agent as such. What do you call the na'ib fa'il in grammatical terminology? The deputy?
The agent, I think that's fine.
It's not the agent anymore, though. I mean, it's not the real agent.
Oh yeah, I guess
na'ib al-fa'il.
I don't know.
Anyway, it was what was originally the object.
Right.
Which is,
I mean, so you would call that you call it the agent and the, what's the
promoted?
word for that? Patient. There we go.
Patient?
That's the word to use. Patient.
Oh, okay, well, that's nice. Okay,
yeah, it's pretty good.
It's nicer than victim.
Yeah.
So كذلك زُيِّنَ. So what is it that's been زُيِّنَ? The qatl. زُيِّنَ قتل. Oh, so that's me. زُيِّنَ قتل شركائهم أولادهم. Right, قتل شركائهم, the killing by their associates of their. Sorry, obviously I can't change the order of the words. So,
right.
So, but the meaning is قتل شركائهم أولادهم. So the reading then is وكذلك زين لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم شركائهم. But then أولادهم is coming between the مضاف and the مضاف إليه.
Right, and that is something that caused some consternation, let's say. So Ibn Khalaway, so one of these tawjih works, and student of Ibn Mujahid says, and this is ugly in the Quran. You're not supposed to have a object in between the construct and the noun that follows it, the genitive form, or the mudaf ilayh. Just to point out real quick, but he says, and the only reason why you would do it is to follow the rasm of the Syrian Mus'haf, which is indeed exactly what we find in the Syrian Mus'haf. So this is not just something they're talking about, something we actually find in the manuscripts. Although what we see is that very often it gets corrected. So these are 3 Syrian Mus'hafs. And with the first one, you can see there was a ya there, so there was a shuraka'ihim, and they actually deleted it. With the second one, something has been rewritten, but actually the Syrian reading is still there. And the third one, once again, that ya has been deleted and a little red wow has been put instead, to make it more palatable as a reading. And here, let's see, what do they even go for? Oh yeah, so they just go for the majority reading. So one question is like, so to a lot of grammarians, I mean, this just putting this awladahum in between khatlu and shurakaihim is just simply ungrammatical, and you can't do it. So how do you translate something that is wrong? Difficult, but in later works, and when people do try to derive some meaning out of it, they say, well, you have to turn it around, right? And then you get something like, likewise, for many polytheists, the killing of their children by their associates has been beautified. Now, the British translation doesn't translate it like this. He says, likewise, for many polytheists, the killing of their children has been adorned by their associates. So here, the shuraka'ihim becomes the agent, again, of zuyyina, while the agent has, of course, been dropped because it's passive.
So what the shuraka are supposed to be doing in Ibn Amir's reading, the shuraka are doing the killing,
yeah.
Whereas in the majority reading, they're doing the inciting.
Right.
But Bridges has gone back and made them do the killing again.
Yeah. Which is actually something.
Sorry, the adorning. He made them go back and do the adorning again.
Adorning, yes. Yeah. And this is actually something that that some of the shared readings has. I think even Sibawayh specifically talks about this because he clearly had some trouble with making sense of Ibn Amir's reading as well. So you can do it in the passive, and you can still make the shuraka do the adorning, but then you need to have it in a nominative. So shuraka ohum. So, well, it's a shared translation, and a translation that is supposed to be translated into 10 canonical readings. It's a perfectly fine reading, but it doesn't fit with the Syrian rasam, and it doesn't fit Ibn Amir's reading.
So ironically, while trying to illustrate the divergence of the translations as much as possible, in this case, he's actually made the translations mean the same.
Converge, yeah.
Which they actually can't. They can't mean the same, because the difference is that in the majority reading, the shuraka are adorning or inciting. And in Ibn Amir's reading, the shuraka are killing. Right. So that has to be different in the translation. So how did the Japanese translation do?
Yeah, so the Japanese translation gets it right, basically. Okuno tashin kyoto ni karera no kyodosha tachi ni yoru karera no kodomo tachi no satsugai ga utsukushiku. What's that last word again? Kazarareta. There we go. So this is the translation of the Ibn Amir reading, where indeed he says, to many of the polytheists, their associates, the killing of the children by many of their associates, has been made beautiful, or has been made beautiful. So here, indeed, the associates, kyodo shatachi, are the ones who are killing, so doing the satsugai. I definitely learned something new about Japanese grammar, even figuring out the syntax on this one. But the niyoru that is placed here actually indeed makes them the ones doing the killing in satsugai. So it translates it correctly, and according to the way it should be.
And interestingly on this, that this is another locus where there has been a lot of criticism directed at Ibn Amir's reading. We mentioned what
I mean, we saw it, right? So Ibn Khalawayh just said it's wrong, right?
And not just the grammarians like that, but exegetes as well. You'd find Zamakhshari, you'd find Ibn Atiyah criticized it from the point of view of meaning.
Right.
Aside from everything else, I mean, it's two different meanings. Which one is the right meaning? The associates are doing the inciting; they're not doing the killing.
Right.
So, based on that meaning, how can we, in a way, sort of to back reconcile it by just translating it like this? It doesn't work grammatically. It cannot mean what Bridges' translation says it means, because then it would have to be something like this shadh reading instead. Okay, this is your deep dive.
Yeah. So
naturally, this is something that comes up a lot in looking at the variation of qira'at, that you've got sometimes things which appear in either fa'ala or af'ala, and then the scholars of tawjih have certain takes on that, and then the translators have certain takes on that. So this is where we're going to get into what lies behind all of that.
So indeed, so the question becomes between the stem 2 and stem 4, or just fa'ala and af'ala. I might just use those terms instead. Well, there's a question: are those translatable differently? And it's not always so easy. So especially with like intransitive verbs, it's clear, if you have nazala, to descend, that nazala and anzala both mean to send down, at least in a broadest sense of the term. With transitive verbs, it's usually not so easy. So like something like fatha, to open, right? It's not so easy to make a stem 4 verb. So aftaha, what would that mean? To make someone open something, maybe? You get it with a couple of verbs like akala, right, to eat, and then akala, to feed. And same with akala, has the same meaning. So you can get it, but it gets kind of hard. Very often you have a stem 2 and a stem 1 pair intransitive verbs like fatha and fattaha, where actually they translate as exactly the same thing. They both are transitive. They both mean to open. Fattaha doesn't mean to make someone open something. And if you look at the tawjih words, it's very clear. Well, they have a clear sense of what this fa'ala is supposed to do. Fa'ala, I should have made sure to pronounce that properly. They say it's something like takrar or takthir, so repetition or I don't know, manyness. So this essentially, when we would look at this in modern linguistic terms, we would call this pluriactionality. Pluriactionality expresses a general meaning of a repeated action, an action simultaneously performed by several agents, an action performed on more than one object, or various combinations of these plural meanings. It's sometimes also called verbal plurality. So the verb is the one that's actually in the plural. So it's as if you go from I don't know, Muslim to Muslimun, right? But instead of doing that to a noun, where you would normally apply plurality, you apply it to the verb, which makes the action of the verb and somehow multitudinous. Yeah, so there we get a couple of these cases, like we have here in فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, which is majority reading. We open for them the gates of everything, sure. Or فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, which Fadl translated as we widely opened, trying to, I think, give a sense of increasing meaning or something like that. But the question is that really what they're going for? Tawjih words would rather focus on the plurality of the gates. So there will multiple gates. So if there's gates open, either at the same time or consecutively, that is a kind of plurality of action, right? And that's why you get fatahna. That's not easy to translate in English, but we could just, focus on the gates themselves. We open for them the many gates of everything, or we open gate upon gate, or something like that. Matsuyama,
or we just lose, or it's just lost in translation, maybe.
Or it's just lost in translation, which is what Matsuyama goes for. He just doesn't translate it differently, which can at times just be the best way to do it. But if you want to maximize it, you kind of go in that direction. A similar thing. So, قد خسر الذين قتلوا أولادهم سفها بغير علم. There we go. And قد خسر الذين قتلوا, right? Fadl translates, lost indeed are those who killed or kept killing their children foolishly with no basis in knowledge, which I think actually quite nicely captures the takrar, I guess, but the pluriactionality. Matsuyama goes for a rather typical example, because qatala is very often, at least if you're Semitist, it comes up very often, because we always use this verb to talk about verbs. This is often mentioned as qatala means to kill and qatala means to massacre, which is in a sense a pluriactionality difference, right? Because massacring is killing a lot of people. But it's not necessarily the only meaning that the pluriactionality of qatala can have. And the meaning probably has more to do with doing it over and over again rather than doing it, a lot of them at once. So the Japanese translation here is probably not as good. So you get orokan ni mo jibun tachi no kodomo o kuroshi or zansachi. So here it's takfir here of the children being killed, right? So a lot of them rather than the takrar of the repetition of doing it. So there's two ways of approaching this. And here it is being translated by Matsuyama, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
And this one is fun. So when the rasam is ambiguous, which is
this is a super famous example, really. Yunzil versus yunazzil, right? And it's given as a general rule a lot of the time.
Right.
Yunzil, so anzala is to send something down at once. Nazzala is to send it down successively. And therefore gradually. So that, there's a whole discussion in the first few verses of Surat Ali Imran about how that applies, whether it applies. So when you're looking at the past tense and it says anzala and then nun zailam, nazzala it would be, you can tell the difference. But when it's in the present tense, imperfect, the rasam itself could look at as yunzil or yunazzil. And then sometimes people say, oh, okay, this verse is like this. But then you realize once you look at more readers that some of the readers actually pronounced it as yunzil and some of them as yunazzil, which complicates the kind of the rule that's being stated as to what each of them is supposed to mean.
Right, and not just that, it's a generalized rule, right? So it's like whenever the rasam is ambiguous, some of the readers read it one way, some of the readers read it the other way, which is, well, if both readings need to be true, it's kind of strange it will be a generalized rule, right? You would expect the places where both meanings are acceptable, they would show up there, and places where you could not do that, you get one or the other, but you don't get that. It's just a general rule. It's like whenever these guys are reading yunzil, the other guys are reading yunazzil, and that's it. Which leaves to some issues. But when we look in the tawjih works, right, Al-Farisi, for example, really says, like, there's no difference in meaning. There's no real way to derive that, which I think makes sense, especially when you're dealing with these generalized rules.
So that can sometimes, I think, again, from a very modern perspective, can upset people because there is a sort of discourse around, I guess, around i'jaz or related to that. It doesn't have to be connected to that, but where every word has to have a very particular meaning. You can't just say that yunazzil and yunzil mean the same thing, because then why did God use this one here and use that one there? Again, there I'm talking about places where it is unambiguous. Where it's ambiguous, you find that the readers went this way and that way. That all supports the view that for them, they didn't perceive a difference. Right? You could certainly say, okay, I actually agree with those readers who went this way, and or the ones that went that way. But what you can't say is that the matter has been established with full clarity and unanimity. So there are each ways to make nazala transitive, right? So to come down or to send down, either nazala or anzala. It could be that there's a sort of, maybe most of the time, one is used more for a certain type and one is used more for a certain type.
Right.
So Matsuyama is, observing or indicating that this rule applies. And then in the Bridges translation, you got something interesting about let's start with that then. Let's start with that about the characters.
Start with that one, okay. So Matsuyama points out that there's a difference, right? And so he goes through quite a lot of detail, showing what tafsirs have said about this, and also says, like, look, even though the says takfir, it's really not clear. Here's a bunch of exceptions. It's quite nice. But then says, clearly realizing how central specifically this word is, he decides to translate it differently, but not So here's the nice thing that happens with the Japanese language. You can use the same word and write it in two different ways. So what he does, he takes the word kudasu, which means to send down, but he uses two different characters, both acceptable characters, but in both cases, it's just an arbitrary distinction. And it's an arbitrary distinction that helps you reconstruct what the Arabic originally said. Because if you see one, you know it's a nazzala, and if you see the other one, you know it was really anzala. So he uses that to kind of break them apart. And what's interesting about this is what we get is there. So we have the same rasm with two different readings, and it is translated with a single reading, but two different rasms, so to speak, two different ways of writing in Japanese, which
Nice.
is a very cute solution. And it's
Yeah.
a kind of playfulness that you can do with Japanese, which very few languages have access to. So that's super cool. Yeah.
So in the British translation, we have wherever nazala appears, to bestow from on high, and anzala is translated as send down. Again, the rationale for that is not explained in the footnotes. I can ask, we can find out. But what I'm saying is, as just a reader of the translation, it doesn't come across as something clear as to why one is assigned this description, one is assigned that description. It might be as arbitrary in a way as the different rasms in Japanese. But I feel that there was something intended or something understood, which is not coming through clearly. A bit like what I said before about you could have taken, you could have charged. لتخذت. In reality, was the difference in taking money and charging money? Is one stronger than the other? In what sense is it stronger? There are some arbitrary distinctions made in the English, which might be because he understands it that way. And similarly, saved and delivered, as we're going to see this example.
Yeah. Do you want to go with this? Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I mean, so what it comes down to, right? So Allahu yunajjikum minha wa min kulli karbin, or Allahu yunjikum minha wa min kulli karbin. So which is translated, so yunaji and yunji are being translated as deliver and save. Matsuyama has no distinct translation, which I think is right. What's kind of interesting about this specific verse is right before this verse, there's also yunaji, but that one isn't disagreed upon. So everyone agrees. Right, that's right. And nobody disagrees on that one. But this one is disagreed upon between the readers. And so Ibn Khalawayh has to kind of go about this and says, well, yunaji could be takrir in some way. But also, when there's readers that have both, so one, the other, and the other one, maybe they're just doing it to show off the two lughatan, right? The two, which we often translate as dialects, but that is not how we use the word dialect in English. Two linguistic practices or two linguistic options. So saying, well, you can say yunji, you can say yunaji, and maybe some of these readers just wanted to show you can do both. Therefore, read one in one way and the other one in the other way, which is kind of interesting to show that apparently to some to Ibn Khalawayh that wasn't a problem, right? Apparently you could just do it in order to show two options, basically.
Yeah. So I think that the distinction between deliver and save needs to be demonstrated. I mean, again, there could be a point of view about it. I certainly looked into it from what I could in terms of English language dictionaries to see how they might be used. So is he understanding perhaps that yunaji is like a stronger sense? Or is it not a stronger sense because yunaji could be delivers, time after time, and then yunji is like to finally save you altogether? I'm not sure how he's seeing it, and just putting the word deliver and save does not clarify that. So I think this, having looked at these overall practices, there are some conclusions that we drew in our presentation about tawjih literature, and readings affect meaning should be taken into account. We should we should use the appropriate literature. There's room for a more thoughtful attempt at translating the qira'at, but Japanese has done, a good job. So I guess at this point, some closing reflections on the project. So our paper is going to deal in more detail with these cases of Surat Al-An'am that we looked at, and how we might go about translating them, and importantly with some theory behind it, because when you're doing something brand new, you need to be able to say, okay, this is the theory that I'm building it upon, and have some kind of scholarly approach and framework for that, and obviously take into account not just the primary literature, and we can count the qira'at as primary literature. We can even count the tawjih al-qira'at works as primary in a certain way, secondary primary. But then there's more contemporary literature and the tafsir works and many other things to take into account when making these conclusions. And what's really good in our collaboration is that you bring to the table a whole other set of tools from linguistics, which help us to analyze things and assess things in more ways than what the Islamic tradition already did. So this is what, nurun ala nur, inshallah, right? To be pious about it. I would reflect on the fact that I think that people, many people, Muslim readers would like to know about the meanings of the qira'at. I don't know beyond Muslim readers who's interested, but
I'm interested.
Yeah, you. But you're a bit on the other side of the table of maybe helping to present these things. Right. But of course, what's happened in the past couple of years is certain controversies have kind of bubbled up and exploded, and it was based on some people saying things in ways that might have been a little bit loose or led to certain controversies. They didn't have to be there. But for many people, the shock was just even the existence of qira'at, because they just hadn't been exposed to that. So I think one of the key aims behind the Bridges project was actually just sort of catch the wave of this emergency, if you like. And that's where I'll say that Ustad Fadl had positive intentions to say, well, let me share the meanings and let's do this before some missionary or Orientalist, no offense, comes and does this, and in order to confuse people, or in a way that confuses people even unintentionally. So let's do it as Muslims. And I definitely sympathize with that. Some of his discourse, though, he talks about the miracle of the qira'at are a miracle, and that makes me nervous. I think in a very broad sense that the Quran is miraculous. I'm on board with that, of course. So the qira'at are included within that. The fact of multiplicity is part of its features, part of the general miracle of the Quran. But to say the multiplicity of readings at different places is itself, each one is a miracle, this puts us in a very tight bind of therefore having to accept every reading from the 7 and from the 10 as being miraculous, instead of being something that is actually open to assessment and critique, as the scholars have done. Like, why did At-Tabari not know that they're miraculous?
Right. I mean, so exactly. So that, I mean, it really opens up a very strange situation when looking at the early authorities. It's like, well, I mean, if you're building your faith upon these great scholars of the Middle Ages, and they apparently never got the memo that qira'at were a miracle. I mean, what do we make of that? I mean, what are you basing your authority on then, even? And that gets into strange conclusions. Let's put it like that.
And ironically, then leads to other problems down the line. So if in a way you're trying to save people's faith through this kind of discourse and claim, then later on, when it starts to crumble, or cracks start to appear in your discourse, then people's faith is threatened even more, because they this certainty. I've said in response to this miracle thing that you may as well talk about the miracle of nasikh and mansukh, the miracle of Makki and Madani. Qira'at is ilm min ulum al-Quran. It is a mode of study. It is about ضبط الكلمات القرآنية, how to, as precisely as possible determine the way that these should be vocalized, pronounced, and then understood. So to class it now as a miracle instead of as ilm min ulum al-Quran, I think is a dangerous territory. I have to say, and I'll say this by way of apology to Ustad Fadl. I wish I had, at this time when he started to incorporate the qira'at in the project, I wish I had volunteered my services. I think, to be honest, I was probably in the middle of my PhD. The only thing I can think that would have prevented me doing it was because I was extremely busy with my PhD. And I did incorporate, by the way, although I changed my topic because Professor Abdul Halim didn't like it, I still, through the back door, snuck in some discussions of qira'at in my thesis. And during that time, as I studied the matter more, my position on qira'at shifted somewhat. And I remember that when I had a conversation with Ustad Fadl about his translation before it was published at his home in London, I remember saying to him that I've got a lot of concerns about this approach that you've got to qira'at. I said, the things that you're saying are things that I said probably a few years ago, and now I've come to realize that the matter is a bit more complicated than that. Even I might have been tempted to say something about miracle of qira'at. I don't know. Tempted, but I don't think I did say anything publicly like that. But basically, my point of view was, this is a marvelous thing that it is wonderful for people to know about the variation of qira'at. We shouldn't be scared of that. We should actually present it to people in a way that gives them understanding, so that they then don't fall prey to, some chatter from here and there, and things that are also baseless critiques. Like, oh, the Warsh Quran says this and Hafs Quran says that. What was the one that was circulating? Khairul Bariya versus Khairul Bari'ah. And people are literally on the internet saying Al-Bari'ah means, Sharrul Bari'ah, the worst of the innocent ones or something.
Yes. That's...
Like, this is worse than anything that in any of the translations that we've talked about.
Yes, for sure.
But it's a fundamental misunderstanding, of Hamza and of recitations. But the thing is that, I'd like to immunize Muslims from that kind of confusion that could come from some quarters. But inshallah, from my perspective, hopefully with your help and involvement after this paper, is to produce something systematic, which can capture the meanings that are recognized in tradition, how those affect translation, some notes and so on. And we have platforms now that can distribute these things in a really appropriate way in digital formats. We have Quran.com, we have other sites as well where these things can be presented. So definitely, as we said in our conclusion, that there is room for more thoughtful translation of the qira'at. And we can make the best of the work that's been done before now as well. Do you have anything you wanted to add, or anything, concluding thoughts?
No, not really. I think it was fun to do this. I think we covered a lot of wonderful ground. It was great to now get to present these slides in a way that did not require us to finish it within 15
gosh, that was
minutes.
Stressful. Yeah. 15 minutes we had for that. This has been like
15, yes.
That plus 2 hours.
We were planning to just not have Q&A, but our dear colleague who was taking the time disagreed that we were not going to have time for questions, so we had to suddenly rush.
I think we raised more questions than we were able to answer in that period.
Yes.
Hopefully today, this discussion has covered not just that material, but some groundwork, and let's see how this one goes, and if any more need to be done in the future.
Yeah. Oh, one final thought. If anyone, we were talking about the لتخذت and لتخذت. I'm definitely not going to go into details of that right now, but if anyone's interested, you can tag me on Twitter or something and ask me to explain what my thoughts on it are. I really don't like the لتخذت reading. I don't think that's original.
That's scandalous. All right. All right. Thanks so much, Marijn, for being with me
Thank
today.
you.
And
Yeah, it's great.
and let's leave it there. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. At least from me, anyway.